Get our mics to work. Hey, I can hear myself.
Hi.
Can we take this thing off? Maybe lower it or something. Hi, everybody. Now we're off. Okay, that's
Hey,
good.
good to see you again.
You too. We haven't seen each other in like 20 years,
Yeah.
and it was a Halloween night. I do believe, and we were sitting at California Street. This thing goes off. Maybe I should just leave it. Okay. We were at my father's house. This was a very usual Halloween at our house over the last few years of my father's life. All the kids from the Catholic high school would come and throw eggs at our house. And we didn't go out, it was like amateur night. And so we would have to sit there and listen to the police radio with all the calls coming in. And so then the cars of the kids, we'd hear the screams, then we'd hear crack. Okay, there's all the eggs. So they had these big long hoses. And so Boyd and I went out, we'd take turns going out with the hoses, you know. And
Yeah, we take turns. He, as opposed to Ken Anger, LaVey said, you know, people think Halloween would be my favorite holiday of the year. It's not. Halloween is amateur night. Because I'm living out my desires every single day of the year. These chumps play dress up one night a year.
Yeah.
And who do they take out their anger on? Me. They come by my house and throw eggs at this house, which they should respect on this of all days.
And toilets.
So,
okay, now why isn't this right? Turning it.
Keep going. The other way.
Righty, tighty.
No matter what I do, it won't
Righty,
stay.
tighty.
The other way. Other way.
Glue! I need glue!
Yeah, it needs something.
oh, he's
Yeah.
a tech guy.
That won't do.
So at any rate, me and Karla would take turns going out. I'd go out for a half hour, then I'd come in, she'd go out. And he had a fence in front of the Black House, and it was, you know, the typical chain link fence, but it had wood slats down it.
Some tape.
And
Duct tape.
because of the street lights, it was well lit out front, but if you were behind those slats, you could be this close to somebody and they didn't know you were there. So I would watch people get out of these cars with a carton of eggs. They would distribute them amongst themselves, and they'd say, okay, we'll all throw them at once, and then we'll run and get in the car and take off really quick. And I'd wait until they all had eggs in their hands, and I'd say, what the hell do you think you're doing? They go, ah! They drop their eggs and run to the car and scoot off. But that was that was our Halloween.
Yeah, but tell them about the time you painted the house.
Oh yeah.
That was like the worst paint job our house ever had. And after my father died, they said how the house was in shambles. Well, this is who you can blame. Because they painted like what water soluble paint over oil or something. So the paint was just coming off in sheets. And under that it was the sort of purple color that we painted the house to distract people so they wouldn't know it was the Black House anymore, like make somebody think somebody else had moved in. The house went through different changes. At one time it was sort of mustard color with brown trim. That was really ugly, but it was a deterrent. When we first moved in, when I was about 4.5 years old, the house was all white in the front. But we bought the house because my father had always wanted a Victorian house. It had 13 rooms, and it had been used as a speakeasy, and it had all these trap doors and everything. And it's what he always wanted. Found it on California Street. Before that, we lived on 37th Avenue out by the beach and by Playland. And when I was just growing up, like there was just growing up, a child, a very small child, I'd be in the crib and I would hear the screams of the children on the roller coaster. So then we went from there, we moved to California Street when I was about 4.5 years old.
Wow.
And after about a year of being there, my father painted the house black. But of course you couldn't buy black house paint in those days, so he used submarine paint.
Yeah, well, in my defense, I think me and an artist named Harvey Stafford painted the front of it, and I think we did a really good job. We were coming home from a restaurant really late at night, and the way the light looked on it, you could see the paint was peeling off, and he said, I really should take better care of this house. It's been so good to me over the years. And I said, hey, I painted houses. I could paint your house. And he said, no. You're an artist. I can't ask you to paint a house. And I said, I'd love to. So this guy, Harvey Stafford, joined me. We got some paint and a long ladder that we had to actually rent and carry down Geary Street all the way to California Street. And it was like a death-defying job. And some of the wood pillars were sort of just like rotting. And we sort of filled those in with putty and replaced some of the wood. And he was extremely happy with it. I don't know
It
how
looked good.
long it lasted after I...
Yeah.
It looked really great.
Yeah, it did at first.
At first, until the weather and everything, and a couple of years went by, and then the chunks started falling off. You know what happens, water over oil paint. It looks great at first.
Who bought the paint? Who bought the paint?
We bought it. We bought it. But Harvey painted houses too, professionally at some point. So he bought what he thought was the best paint. And it was latex paint. It wasn't like, have you ever worked with the oil paint? You have to mix varnish in with it. Forget about it.
Well, I guess that's what was on that lasted so long before. I don't know, I think my father painted it the first time. He'd paint everything. Before he'd have parties, he'd go through and he'd paint the entire house. And he said he did it because it just felt so great after to see how wonderful everything looked. And that you should do that yourself. So he had me doing things like when the inside of my Mercedes-Benz started falling apart, I was repairing the inside of it, like with duct tape and contact paper. And we used contact paper for everything. Like we had, before we had a marble tombstone, we had this like piece of wood, well, he covered it with marble contact paper. So some people in duct tape, well, that's good too. We had, everything in our family was done with, yeah.
Yeah, well, some of the paint inside the house, like in the kitchen, it was peeling and cracking. And I remember when Ken Anger was staying there, he'd walk around with a big black Sharpie. And if there was like a chip in the paint or a crack, he would take it out and mend it. And he would keep saying, aesthetics is everything. Aesthetics is everything.
Yeah, he would go over the paint. Like the upstairs was my room and I painted it this green color, but it wasn't the greatest green color in the world. And this had lasted since I was a teenager. And so he went in and he made it like this. He added on these sort of chartreusey colors and everything. He made it really cool. And he brought his own curtains with him and they were floor to ceiling. And actually then when we had to go through this thing where I had to keep my father in the house and I was doing real estate at the time, this man who was a friend who was also my real estate broker was trying to buy the house and had these mortgage guys look at it. And we went outside in the backyard and took him down the rickety old back stairs where the lion used to live back there. And then we had the Doberman Pinscher who lived out there. And they walked back and it was all overgrown. And he said, "This is a dungeon. How could we give a loan on this?" And so there were some problems there. He ultimately did work out, and he was able to get the house so my father was able to stay there for the rest of his life. That's when Diane was suing him. And that was a horrible ordeal, and that's when Ken moved in with us for about a year. And that's why, as I said, he put up all the curtains. But he did, there upstairs we had a railing, and it was like a brown color, but Ken painted over the brown color railing. He got some like shiny paint, some that thick, what do you call it? Well, anyway, he put this really thick coat of paint over it, and he covered everything up and made it like perfect, but made it like, well, it was all stone. It looked like stone. This man that lived with us for a while, Chuck Huntley, we were just mentioning his name because he lived in our house and sort of worked as a handyman and stuff. And he was in the photographs we were talking about on the cover on Church of Satan on their website. They have this big photograph that's taken from Time magazine. There was an article in like 1970, and it was called The Occult Revolution or something like that. And so there were photographs of all of us in San Francisco, And there was one photograph that has all of us in these heads, and we're wearing these paper mache heads. And I was in the center, and I always wore the boar's head, the white boar's head, and I was wearing a lavender Baphomet because I used to make them. They're originally made by a place, these people, Laura Lee and Dion Vignier, and they had a really beautiful shop called Noir in San Francisco, and they were the first ones to really do these really elaborate things in enamel, and they were the first ones that did our trapezoid jewelry and trapezoid ashtrays, because originally before the Church of Satan it was a great big trapezoid because my father had the law of the trapezoid. But anyway, then this woman Laura Lee, they started making the Baphomet, the original Baphomet symbols, because there was no place to have them made, so the store made them for us, and they were very good friends of ours. And they'd go to the circus with us and everything. And so anyway, then she taught Diane how to make them with a stylus and everything. And so we would do that, and I did it too to make a little bit of extra money when I was going to high school. And so some were made by Diane, some were made by me. And it was a lot of fun making them, and I always think of doing again. I still have one of the kilns. But I saw that one of them would be here tonight. But anyway, I don't know.
I have a question.
Your father told me that the very first few Baphomets were made by Kurt Saxon.
He made other things.
Oh.
He made the triptych or something. There was something else he made, some other little things that were made out of enamel.
I have a question. I've heard that when a new person enters the Black House, that there was a whole spectacle when they enter. Can you speak to that?
Tony.
What, the lion?
Well, no, as far as coming out of the...
Okay.
Yes,
I
so
know
I think
exactly
Boyd
what you
knows the
mean.
story, yes.
Yeah, I read when I was a kid, there was an issue of Man, Myth, and Magic that featured the Church of Satan. Had a beautiful picture of you on the back of the magazine.
Standing in front of the house.
Yeah, groovy picture. I used to look at those pictures forever when I was a kid. And there was a description of the house, and it said, it says the Church of Satan Library has signs on the bookshelves that says, anybody caught removing a book from these shelves will have their hands amputated.
Yeah, I still have those.
And I thought, that is so cool.
But that's how he felt. That was for real. He believed in the Code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Yes.
Yeah. So,
Hail Satan!
but the first night I came over there, it's like, going there is a spectacle. It's like Blanche answers the door, and she has this wolf dog, this snarling wolf dog. She's barely able to hold back with two hands, and it's going.
Wait, you mean Bathory, the German Shepherd?
Yeah.
She
Down
heard of
Bathory. Down Bathory. But she leads you into the room, says the doctor will be with you shortly, and you're sitting in this purple room all alone, and there on the bookshelves were those signs, anybody caught removing books will have their hands amputated. I thought, wow, this is the place I used to read about when I was 13 years old. So I'm sitting there waiting for the man to appear, and I hear this weird noise. I'm thinking, what the hell is going on? And then I see something moving, and the entire fireplace just like opens up, and he crawls from a hole in the ground.
And I have that fireplace.
With his elbows, and he looked like some sort of bat creature. It was quite stunning. Wonderful way to meet Anton LaVey.
He built that fireplace. There was that trapdoor. It was all open there. It would open, but he built a frontispiece for it, which was like a phony fireplace, and he put those logs in it. You could light up. They would change color and everything. But yeah, he would open it up, and people would be sitting there in the purple room, and all of a sudden they'd hear this noise, and here he'd come like up from the basement. There was this like storage room under there. There's a big ladder, so we'd have to crawl up a ladder to come, and that ladder went all the way up to the top to what we called Uncle Enar's room. And Uncle Enar was like my sort of imaginary friend when I was a little girl. My father made up for me. So now we have like a sect. I'm sorry to say that, the sect of the Enarians. Uncle Enar was a Cyclops. And our friend Jim Osborne, he said it's the be-all, know-all, Inarians. And nobody knows. Nobody really knows who the Inarians are. Not even the Inarians.
Yeah, I knew Jim Osborne. He was a comic artist who did bizarre profiles in underground comics in the 60s. And he had been friends with the family in the 60s, throughout the 60s. And anything I said, Jim would say, you know who you need to meet is Anton LaVey. He's into exactly everything you're into. He likes Tiny Tim, he likes Ed Gein, you know, and I thought, well, it's a small town, San Francisco. Eventually our paths will cross, and they did. And even I think about a year before I met him, I saw his Jaguar in Cala Foods with a personalized license plate that said Zandor. And I thought, I wonder if that's Anton LaVey's car.
Yeah.
And I sat there for a long time waiting for him to come out, and then I was an alarm agent, and I got a call on the radio and had to go to a site of a break-in. So, and then I thought, that wasn't Anton LaVey's car, but then turned out it was.
I met Jim Osborne around 1971 when he was working at the Richelieu Theater, when a man that I met when I'd been working at a place called Originals by Nature that sold gemstones. I'd drive out like a few days a week out to Fisherman's Wharf, which is now the restaurant that's owned by Don Johnson, oddly enough. I remember when I was actually at the opening, because my boyfriend is best friends with Don Johnson, or was at the time. So there I was standing there at the opening of this restaurant. This is where I worked when I was like 19 years old. And it was like this thing that you would open up with you don't take the key and open it up, whatever. It's right across the street in the Maritime Museum. And so anyway, I met Jim from my boyfriend, a man that I met when I was working at that store, who came in to sell us some turquoise from Arizona. So I can get turquoise from anywhere. He's a jeweler. And I started being in the jewelry business at that time. So that was my boyfriend, but he said in one of the first phone calls to me, he said, I have a friend that I really want, it's just like our first date. I have this friend and I really want you to meet him. I think you're just really gonna get along with him great. I thought, well, what is it? Are you gay or something? Like, why do you want me to meet this guy? You're so hot for me to meet this guy. You just gotta meet him, you gotta meet Jim. So anyway, he took me down to see, actually, it was a John Waters movie. It was the one with the smell-o-vision. What is that?
Oh, yes.
The cards?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, sir. Oh,
Yeah,
yes, sir.
yeah. So Jim Osborne was like able to run the projector, and he was like projectionist and all that. He worked at all these theaters around town at the time, but he was also a cartoon. He was an underground cartoonist, like Art Crumb and those guys, and he did like Felch and all that stuff. And so anyway, I came down the elevator, and I was wearing an orange like sweater skirt and like a black and brown top. And Jim Osborne, he always said to everybody after that he saw me, and he said, shh. Well, it turned out those were his birthday colors because he was born November 1st. And he said, I thought that was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. And so we had remained friends after that, and he came to visit us when we lived in Florida and said, why do you guys live in Florida? It's so awful here. And so we remained friends until he died, and he lived with our friend Grux, who's here right now tonight, who has all of his artwork and most of it. I have a little bit. But anyway, so Jim Osborne, though, did the masthead for the Cloven Hoof.
Oh, wow.
And my boyfriend that I was talking about was one of the signatures of the Fong on the very first membership cards.
Oh, I always wondered who that was.
Yeah, that was Dominic.
Yeah.
Oh, and you know about Ken. When I first met Ken, I thought he was just the coolest guy in the world, because this was like when Carnaby Street was first happening, and I was a teenager, and the Beatles were first starting, and all the really cool stuff from England and everything. And Ken had lived over there, and he came back, and he was wearing these like beautiful velvet and velour striped suits and things. And he brought us these wonderful gifts, and he was just the coolest guy. And he became like Uncle Ken, and he was a part of our family. And then later on, there was one time when Ken got really messed up on acid, and there was a theater in North Beach, and it was called the Red not the Red Vic, but do you know what it is? It was
World Theater.
I do not. I think that was gone by the time I got there.
Yeah, there was an apartment above the theater, and Ken got really whacked out, and like he painted it all, like in red paint. He poured paint just all over it, and so he was taken to jail. And so my father went to bail him out. And yeah, he was in there all night. So ultimately, he did get out. But it was like, she's one of my fond recollections of Ken, because he would get really, really out there sometimes. And my father didn't do drugs at all like that, and but they were really good friends. But they'd always have this sort of competitive relationship. Ken would come over and he'd bring these records and stuff. I really want to play you my records, and my father said, no, I want to play you my records. Yeah. And so Ken, he did bring some things that I listened to all the time. Like he brought a Byrds album that I just loved, and I would dance. We had this skeleton named Reuben, and he had Paget's disease, and he had been taken from UC up at Parnassus in San Francisco from someone a doctor who worked there that thought nobody wanted him anymore for any medical studies, so he thought he'd be comfortable at our house. And so Reuben was in this big glass cabinet, and Reuben, because he had Paget's disease, his head was on a hinge, and he could like tip his hat. His hat was well, it wasn't his hat, it was the top of his head, because the top of his head was like this crust that was like 2 inches thick, which is not normal for a skull. And so, and he had this really distorted body, like he was sort of a hunchback when he was alive. So anyway, we had this Victrola, and I would put on these records like what Ken gave us, like the Byrds, which my father never listened to, of course, but I listened to it. So I would dance with the reflection of the glass of Reuben. We called him Reuben. And we had Reuben for years and years, until in Witchcraft 70, they showed Reuben. And I think my father mentioned in a book also that he had Reuben. Well, someone from UC saw Reuben, and they took Reuben back, and so we were just heartbroken.
Ooh,
yeah.
not cool.
Yeah, so does anybody care about Reuben anymore? I don't know. But,
Yeah.
you know, he lives on, you know, as Jim said, you will not be forgotten.
Yeah, there are photos of him. But when you were saying that, it reminded me of a Ken Anger story. You were mentioning the horrible divorce. So
Yeah,
he's
it
going
was like
through-
War of the Roses. He brought over War of the Roses to show my father. You just have to see this, because it was like him and Diane. Because Diane, we had the top part of the house. Now this house originally was, my grandparents put the down payment on for my mother and father, and me to live when I was 4.5 years old, because we had all lived together in the flat on 37th Avenue. My grandparents lived on the bottom, and we lived on the top. And so they sold that, and they said, well, now we can basically get 2 separate units, because my father really loved this house and everything. So that's how that all started. So it was really hard when many years later, when my mother and father had divorced, even though then my mother came to me when I was 18 and said, oh, Karla, I hate to tell you this, but your father's a bigamist. And she said, how could that be? She said, well, it's because our divorce was never finalized. And so anyway, I guess they got that taken care of, but she thought that he had been married to Diane, but it turned out that they never really got married. And so anyway, so that's just another silly little story.
Well, the story I remember is like some big divorce movie. I don't know if it was War of the Roses or
Yeah.
Kramer versus Kramer or something.
Yeah, it was
But-
palimony.
But
Yeah.
Ken says, you've got to watch this movie. With what you're going through, you've got to watch this movie. And he said, what's it about, Ken? And he said, it's about this couple going through a really contentious divorce. He said, I have no interest in seeing that, you know. And he said, well, I'm going to run it out because you must see it. He says, don't run it out. I'm not going to watch that movie. So the next day, Ken comes in and he says, look what I've rented, and I'm going to sit here and make you watch this movie. He said, Ken, I don't want to watch the movie. He says, no, you have to. He says, I'm not watching it. And when Ken insisted again, he went over to this cabinet, got out this chrome-plated gun with pearl handles, went over to him, held it up to his head, and said, Ken, I'm not watching the movie. don't make me do this, Ken. Don't make me do it.
Yeah.
And Blanche at the time said, I was sure I was going to be cleaning Ken Anger's brains off the purple walls there.
Yeah, well, I also, there was something about Ken that he didn't say tonight. And I don't know how many people know about this, but Ken made a movie called Invocation of My Demon Brother, and my father was the devil in it, and he made it in San Francisco, one of these embassies where he'd been living at the time. It was right around where you live, Grux, right around the corner. We had a great big mansion on the corner of Fulton, right by the park, right by Alamo Square. And so, anyway, my father went down there, and they had these heads that they purchased at Lou Serban's on Powell Street a little while before this. And my father bought, of course, the devil head and the boar's head, as I was talking about, the one that I wore in the photographs. And we had a big cat's head, and they had some bird's head. And so, anyway, these were some really cool heads. So anyway, they used these heads in Invocation of My Demon Brother. But Mick Jagger did the soundtrack on a Moog synthesizer for Invocation of My Demon Brother, and that was at the request of Ken. And then when Mick and Bianca were getting married, Ken related the story about it. He said to Bianca, "Why don't you take that disgusting cross off your neck?" So he had like a personal relationship with him. But then after that, Mick Jagger came out with his Sympathy for the Devil.
Wow.
I thought that was an interesting little story, but Ken doesn't remember it.
Do you still have your DeLorean?
Yes, I do. Right next to the cord, the 37 cord.
Yeah, because I used to hear stories. It's like there weren't any DeLoreans in San Francisco, and when her and her father would pull into Marin County or Mill Valley to go to a gas station, and the doors opened up like this. They looked like big bat wings or something. When people saw that pull in, it looked like something from outer space anyway. And when the doors opened, these people just like all stop what they're doing and come and just look.
Well, people would come out, even when it was 5 in the morning, and I'd go take it to a gas station, like take it to the Shell station. That's where I usually went. We would drive for our gas. We'd go from 23rd in California, drive through Golden Gate Park, all the way to the other side, to the Shell station. It stayed open 24/7. And buy gas there, and it was really expensive too. And I'm like, why don't you do that? But anyway, that was just what we did. So it was late at night, and sometimes I'd do that, and I'd get out, and there'd all be these people all around the car. Where'd these people come from? What do they do? Peer out their windows all night? But no, the DeLorean was my car that I bought from the commission from a real estate deal. But everybody thought it was my father's car, and I let him drive it. He loved to drive the car, so when we go places, he go, "I want to drive the DeLorean." Okay. Well, I had such big seats that I think it was more comfortable because the DeLorean's really made for a 6-foot-tall man, and my father was 6 feet tall. He was the same size as DeLorean, I guess. So it was way easy. I'd have to put a pillow behind my back and put a sweater under myself. And it would always break down like in the worst places, like the middle of the projects or something. And so anyway, yeah, they were not the most reliable cars. But my father loved that car, and he wanted me to park it in front of the house. And it would rain, and the seals weren't totally great at the top of it. And I'd go out there, it's like a swimming pool in the back seat of the car, and it started to grow mushrooms and everything. And then of course, I'm the one that has to go out and deal with fixing the car. And when the car would break down, my father would say to me, well, after he would drive it, he'd say, "Well, the car doesn't like you." He wanted it to be his car. Wherever you go, people would always think, even if it was me driving, and then the valet would come and bring the car back, they'd bring it to him. "Here, sir." They'd give him the keys. It's like, "No, it's my car." Things. You know? So yeah, my father always gave these things like their atoms and molecules to him had like feelings. Like all of his things he had since childhood and everything, he was very, very possessive of them. Like they really meant something more. They meant something more than objects to him. He felt like they were good luck for him, or they were an actual part of him. And when Diane left, she wanted to take all these things from him, and she was threatening the sheriff's department would come in, and he had his stuffed jaguar, which I have now, because I treasure these things because they meant so much to him, and I can't, you just can't bear to part with things when you know how much they meant to somebody like that. And so anyway, he said, if the sheriff's department tries to come in and take Igor, they're not taking Igor, I will shoot them first. And he had so much artillery.
Yeah.
And everything was cocked and ready to go.
Wow.
Yeah,
Every
an arsenal.
room. Every room.
I went over one time and he had a briefcase and he set it on my lap and he opened it up and it was a sniper rifle in parts that you had to put together, and he said, "Boyd, in your lap is the world's finest sniper rifle. I could take a lug nut off the tire of the car 2 blocks away with this." And he really was expecting, this divorce was really ugly and the police would be sent in to take stuff away. And he was saying, if I have to burn this place down, they aren't taking anything. If I have an armed standoff with the SFPD, I've got better weapons than they do.
Yeah, it was true. And one thing, my boyfriend at the time, he said, he went over and he saw my father, and my father's sitting there, and he's got like one little pistol strapped to his leg. He's got one strapped to his arm. He said, "Why'd your dad gotta wear all that? He's scary enough as it is."
Well, the story I heard was he started carrying all the time.
Oh,
when
yeah,
there
he
was
did.
a weird woman outside the house. Do you remember
Oh,
the
there
story?
was more than once. Oh, but I got a story too.
Okay.
I take him for rides when his health wasn't as good, because he would take me for rides before we'd go to the park and everything. When I was a kid, he'd take me like to the, as a matter of fact, when I was a little girl, my father was a photographer. I mean, here we've got more stories, not to get really off it, but we'd go to the Academy of Sciences, and there was a Benny Bufano statue, and he took my photograph in front of the Benny Bufano statue. It was only like 2.5 years old, but it was like the picture of the week that he took, and so that was in the paper. But we would go to the museums and everything, and later we'd go with the lion, take the lion for walks to the museum, and we would also take our dog, our English Bull Terrier, and people would run because they'd say it's one of those killer dogs, and it was the sweetest little dog, and was actually blind and sort of half blind and deaf. But anyway, whatever got me started on that was what we were talking about. You said something about my father and...
Oh, okay, yeah. So I'd heard this story that there was this weird woman wearing a white diaphanous gown standing in front of the house all day long. Diane went someplace, noticed this woman, and she came back, the woman was still there. Zena was a little girl, came home from school, the woman's still there, and she says, "There's this weird woman out there." And Diane said, "Yeah, she's been out there all day long." And then when LaVey wakes up, they tell him there's a strange woman. She looks a little creepy, and she's been out there all day. He said, "I'll go have a word with her and send her off." So he walks up and he says, "I have a lot of friends on the SFPD. I used to work with them. I want to ask you to please leave right now, or I'll have to make a phone call." He started feeling this weird sensation in his stomach. He looked down. This woman was stabbing him repeatedly, but she had like a blunt knife, like a butter knife or something. So he got completely bruised up, and then eventually he threw her on the ground and sat on her and said, "Diane, call the cops, this woman's nuts." And this woman, at the time I knew LaVey, this woman was still in a psychiatric hospital and would still send him letters every single week. But I was told that after that, he never left the house without a gun on him someplace.
So I drove him up to Stowe Lake. He used to sometimes drive around Stowe Lake and look at the birds and everything. But he wanted to stop. There's a restroom right down at the bottom, and it's still there, right below the boathouse. And he turns to me and he pulls out of his pocket and he hands me this little pistol and he says, "Here, hold this while I go take a leak." I mean, that was like common stuff.
Yeah, and another gun story, he at one time told me that every window in his house was hooked up it was booby trapped with a shotgun. So that anybody trying to enter the thing, he said they'd be cut in half by the shotgun. And I told him the story. There had been a story in the news, some liquor store guy in Florida had been robbed repeatedly. So he hooked up a car battery to the grates of metal bars that people were always taking off to come in and rob him. And the next guy that tried to rob him grabbed onto these bars to take them off. He was electrocuted and fell down dead. And not only did he go to jail for that, he was sued by the dead man's family for everything he owned. So when he telling me the story about the booby-trapped window, I told him that story, and he said, yeah, I suppose that could happen if they found a body.
Oh, I had the same Mercedes I was talking about earlier. People would always try to steal the emblem, and you'd see sometimes that it would have been tampered with sometimes. And so I thought, okay, I've gotten an idea. And they used to sell these razors. They're since discontinued. It was like a strip of razor. And so got it and very carefully glued the strip of razor around the circle with the Mercedes-Benz emblem, so that when somebody took their finger to try to get it up, well, they wouldn't be able to do it because they would cut their hand. So occasionally I'd go out and look at there, I see blood all over the place. So I continued to make those, and I was able to hang on to the Mercedes emblems for way longer. Eventually they'd get them. It worked pretty well.
Excuse me. Snuff is a horrible habit. I had meant to bring what they call his Necronomicon, the Johnson Smith catalog. And it's a turn-of-the-century catalog full of these bizarre hoaxes, pranks, bad jokes, and they're usually intended to cause extreme pain to somebody, and to the great delight of everybody else onlooking. And they always call that person the victim. And they'd always say, wait till you see the look of consternation on your victim's face. And it had things like the dying pig, which is a rubber pig you blow up, and then as the air starts to go out, it makes this awful noise. It sounds like a dying pig, and it shakes, and then it falls down on its legs, and it falls over to one side. And there was the anarchist stink bomb, which was said to cause more consternation than a Limburger cheese. And he liked these things so much, he actually enlarged these little things out of the catalog, so they were 8 by 10, had them framed. I remember the anarchist stink bomb was in the kitchen, and then there were a few more in some of the bathrooms. There was like one free book for weak men, teaching you how not to masturbate.
Yeah, he liked all of those, the backs of the comic books, those things that you could buy. But I was thinking about some of the nasty things that people would do. Somebody once put on our doorstep a baby shark that they'd caught out at the beach, and there was like some Christian pamphlet from and my father felt so sorry for it. He took it inside and put it in the bathtub, and then later took it back out to the beach and hoped it might find its way back. But he was always doing things like that with animals and trying to save them and trying to put them back in their natural habitat, whether or not it would do any good. And then he had all the spiders in the house, and we had so many spider webs, cobwebs, they'd grow so big. I mean, Gretz could tell you, we actually saved one that was in the bathroom. It like took up the whole square, like 4x4 of the bathroom. And we stuck it on a big piece of cardboard and put like some saran wrap over it because nobody had ever seen such an enormous cobweb. But he said the spiders were his friends. Like one day he came back and he had this great big bite on his leg, and this like hematoma. It's like, what is that? And, oh, well, I guess one of the spiders. So it's like, well, one of your friends bit you, huh? But he loved the spiders, and we had a tarantula named Bruno when I was growing up, and it would walk down, he let it run down our front hallway all the way, and it had its own little cage and everything. And we had lots of odd pets. We had a capybara for a while.
What?
We had a crocodile.
World's largest rodent, a capybara.
Yeah.
It looks like a giant rat, but without the tail.
Yeah, but what people don't realize is that we really truly were like an Addams Family before there was the Addams Family book. There were a few books out, but they weren't as evolved as what it turned into, and this was before the TV show. Because my father refused to watch TV, and so whenever anybody would mention the Addams Family on TV, you kind of bristling. No, watch that. And yet here we were, like, doing, like, people tell me, I mean, I didn't realize at the time, I mean, just growing up, this is just our life, you know, and then somebody later, my boyfriend, he said, you know, because he went to school with me, you know, how everybody looked at you, you know, you really were like the Addams Family, because by then it was on the TV. But we dressed a little bit differently, but we did wear a lot of black. And I wore black nail polish before they ever sold in the stores. I found in my father's stuff he had some black car touch-up paint. So I grew my nails like 1.5 inches long and wore car touch-up paint. And I put a little pentagram on my face every day to go to school when I was a teenager. But my picture was on the magazine cover and other stuff all over the world then.
Yeah,
I was like, but I've been told by people I was Elvira before Elvira. Slightly different outfit, but same sort of idea. But the real thing, not a character in a movie. The real thing.
I love the picture of you, and it was in a million magazines, and on the cover of an Italian magazine, it was like you holding a skull and your chin on it, and it's just, I looked at that forever when I was 13. I was just thinking, wow,
that was
people
taken,
are living like this.
Yeah, that was taken by these people, Jack and Betty Cheatham, that were Time Life photographers, and those photos were then sold to Magnum Photos. But they went all over the world. They were in like every single European magazine. But loads more pictures. Like there's a photograph that's downstairs of my father in front of the Jaguar, the car. And a lot of them were taken like up at the Palace of Fine Arts, or Palace, or what is Legion of Honor. We would go up there a lot for photographs. And they took some really beautiful ones. A lot that are lost that I know who has them. But now we have to get them next, get them back.
And when we were talking about Halloween earlier, I would never forget this one time we were there for Halloween. Karla shows up and she's wearing these tight-fitting jeans, some brown boots up to about her knees, this tight-fitting t-shirt with spaghetti straps, and I think it said Harley Davidson or something. And she sat down, she's talking for a long time, and we're having a normal conversation. She says, I'm so annoyed nobody's commented on my Halloween costume. She said, have you ever seen me wear anything like this in my life? And Anton said, well, no, I was wondering. She said, this is what I'm wearing for Halloween.
But I guess I thought I was dressed like a regular person.
That's exactly right, yeah.
I don't even remember that one.
It was a good idea, it was high concept.
Thank you, boy.
So, thank you so much, Karla and Dwight. I would like to open up the room for a few questions before the ritual at midnight. Are there any questions here for Karla and Dwight? Yes, you, my dear.
The evolution from the magic circle to shutting up the Church of Satan and shuttering the windows. Like,
Yeah,
what was the
that's-
timeline? It was the order of the trapezoid.
Well, it all started in the late 50s. Say mid-50s to late 50s and is when the magic circle started. My father gave lectures on all kinds of subjects, werewolves, vampires, things that are considered a cult. They were considered a cult then, now they're just mundane, sort of like astrology. But then the only thing people knew about astrology was they could read their weekly horoscope in the paper. So all these things that at one time were, they were not very popular, really became a big thing. So he gave lectures on all these talks, and he did psychic investigations and stuff, all these things they have TV shows on now. But also, he knew how to work this ISIS you know, about Dr.
Oh, yeah.
Nixon had ISIS, and my father was the only one that he gave the recipe to, or whatever, the secrets to how to operate ISIS, which was one of the very first artificial human companions. ISIS could answer the door for this man, Dr. Nixon. He was a character my father was starting to write a book on, but never finished that. He gave somebody else some of that information, and they wrote a book on him.
Yeah, Doran Wittelsbach did a very excellent book on
Right.
Dr. Nixon.
Yeah,
It's small,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it's lavish.
Yeah.
It does him justice. Credit your father, credit where credit is
So then
due.
it turned into what, then it was the Satanic Church, which is why I took over that name, calling what I did later the First Satanic Church, because that was before my father was doing something that was like a name to catch attention. So then later he changed, in '66, he changed it to the Church of Satan, and then there was so much publicity about that, and then, well, how long did that go on, basically? Well, I mean, it still continues on, but it's not the same as it once was. And so, in 1999, I started First Satanic Church. So just breaking away from that, trying to keep it to how my father originally did things.
What-
But my father did send me to Amsterdam. We did have our international world headquarters in Amsterdam in the 80s. And my father had me go there to oversee that and be his liaison. So, yeah, I think that's maybe what you're referring to.
Well, the
So-
magic circle started, right?
The magic
Then
circle. The magic circle started, like, way back in the 50s, early 60s.
And what was it?
Oh, that was a group of people that got together, and that was sort of the beginning when they had the lectures and everything. And those were people that believed in and wanted to know more about magic and just these unusual topics. And those were like the parties that they had with the magic circle. Like at that time, they had big Halloween parties, and my father would get the house all fixed up and everything for those then. So it was just one thing sort of led to another. And then, but what people don't realize is that my father really was really well known in San Francisco, first off as a musician, but also as an artist. And he and my mother both had their art exhibited in North Beach. They have those art fairs. They were both members of the San Francisco Art Guild. And you can still find their names in the very early my father started painting in 1952, the year that I was born. He did a lot of art his entire life. So we have lots of art that he did, his drawings and everything from when he was a child. He was really an incredible artist, and he just one of those people that just takes a pen and just draws anything he sees, and was really good at it. But he was also good at doing illustration and design work and everything. Like he did do for his father, he did a real estate sign, Beacon Realty, we were just talking about. He was really good at colors and putting everything together to make things really striking. And whenever I would be doing some art for a poster or something, he'd say, when I was a kid, he'd say, "Hey, do it like this," and he'd like have a great big arrow pointing to something very large that would really stand out, and when face. And he'd say, "Yeah, do it in these colors." So when I was really young, he was teaching me all these really great things. And so he just continued and carried that on throughout his life. But he was a great teacher to everybody who was around him, I think. And he was very willing to help people and give them things, information. So he said, what was it he said? My greatest flaw is being too nice.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people would take advantage then and get
Everybody.
upset at what he would find then, what they would do with the stuff, or what would turn up in the media or whatever.
Yeah, and he was able, in his paintings, he was able to do some technique that seemed almost iridescent, like he'd just have a big old fat gal's face, but it would look sort of iridescent. And he saw me looking at one of these one night, and he said, "What are you looking at, really?" And I said, "There's something about this reminds me of this artist, Ivan Albright." He said, "Ivan Albright, that's one of my favorite artists." He said, "That's the highest praise I can imagine. And you didn't even know I was into Ivan Albright. I didn't know that you were, but it makes sense. We're both into this guy." And if you've never seen his paintings, he does things like big, huge paintings of doors, and they're just totally iridescent and beautiful looking, but they're rotting. They're just rotting and peeling apart. It's amazing stuff. They have a huge collection of him in the Chicago Museum.
Yeah, I have that painting, The Bride. He took that after one of our family friends.
Yeah, he
I
told
take
me she was
pride
really
in my
comfortable.
father's, but they're all oil paintings. And yeah, he did have a very special talent, and he did do a lot of skeletons.
Yeah.
And then he did one painting, and he looked at, well, why do you have that up? Because I put them all up in my house. He said, what would somebody say about that? What would Freud say about that? Because he'd have like these mountains and these very phallic looking things and these skeletons crawling up mountains and things. But this was 1952, that people didn't do that kind of stuff then.
We have a few drawings downstairs, original Anton drawings, so if you want to check them out. And the glass
Case.
cases, yes. Sorry, I've had a hell of a night. I will take 2 more questions, please, before the Black Mass ritual at midnight. Anybody else have anything interesting?
Oh, there was one thing I thought of. We were just discussing tonight. Sorry to interrupt you. We'll take 2 questions, but yeah. Well, I was talking about my father and the things he did before the church even started, and he was in a lot of the columns as being an artist and everything, and as well as for giving the lectures. And somebody said that my father had a reputation for not liking like rock and roll music and everything. And well, Boyd knows a lot about the music he liked too. But my father actually really did like the Beatles when they first started, and a family friend, gave me a scalper's ticket to see the Beatles at the Cow Palace the first time they came to the San Francisco Bay Area. And my father was concerned about me going alone, and so his friend said, well, you've got your police pass, why don't you just accompany her? So he did. He took me to see the Beatles, and there was, oddly enough, a seat right next to my seat that was vacant, of all things. All these girls were just screaming so loud you couldn't even hear the Beatles and everything. But anyway, he did go with me, and it was in this column called the James Drury column that Anton LaVey took his daughter to go see the Beatles that night. So,
Yeah, and he was often in Herb Cain's column.
yes.
And everybody in San Francisco read
Yeah.
Herb Cain's column to find out what was happening.
Yeah.
And he was always interesting news. So,
Yeah.
so he was really well known there before he broke out to the rest of the United States. He was
Yeah.
kind of a figure around the city.
And as far as music that he liked, we were like listening to music downstairs, and I'm like, okay, well, this has nothing to do with anything that he was doing. Because what did he like? We talked about who did he like? Well, he liked Mrs. Miller. That was one of his favorites.
We've got some Mrs. Miller on the playlist. Hard Day's Night.
Yeah. And Tiny Tim. And I actually met Tiny Tim because my boyfriend at the time got this gig playing like with this surfer music at what is it, American Radio Hall? What's it called in San Francisco? Great American Music Hall. And he said, I did it for you because I did it for your birthday present because I had this chance to play with Tiny Tim. And so they were like the act that played before Tiny Tim. So we spent the entire evening with Tiny Tim after, and he was such a great guy. And I talked to him, and we actually discussed, and Tiny Tim said he was totally up for coming back to San Francisco and doing a recording, doing like an EP with my father. And then it was like the only night of the year I couldn't reach my father. Like calling him, we're waiting all night for him. I'm calling and calling. This is before cell phones. This is not easy. And couldn't reach him. It turned out it was like one of the only nights of the year he went to somebody's house for dinner, which of course, who was there? It was Karen Greenlee, who was what she known for, the repentant necrophile, who I took with Jim Osborne to spend Christmas evening with him in like 1992, when Blanche was going to be going to see her family, and I was going to go see some relatives, and so I wanted someone from my father to hang out with, and so he thought it'd be interesting to meet Karen Greenlee. So Karen Greenlee, that was like one of the greatest nights of her entire life. She found somebody who really understood, and she told him her entire story, and said, this is somebody that I could really speak my heart to, completely understood. And so they became good friends after that.
Karen and Jim?
Karen and my father.
Oh.
They ate ice cream. I have such fond memories of eating ice cream Sundays with your father, and Boaz with his head bobbing the snake while my father played the keyboards.
Now, Karen Greenlee was in the headlines sometime in the 80s because she worked in a mortuary, working with cadavers, and she would have sex with them. And she fell in love with this one cadaver, stole his body in a hearse, drove up into the mountains. She was missing for days. The police finally found her laying next to this cadaver in this hearse, and she was in the headline news, and she lived in Sacramento. Everybody in Sacramento would go, there's that girl who fucks corpses. So my friend Jim Morton wrote to her and said, you should move away from Sacramento, come to San Francisco. There are a lot of people who'd like to meet you. So she did. She met all these accepting people and, became friends with all the cool people on the scene in San Francisco. And she now lives, if she still lives there, Colma, which is a city, an entire city of graveyards.
Yeah.
And the city council puts on a bumper sticker that says, it's great to be alive in Colma.
Yeah. So, questions?
Yes, 2 more questions, please, because we have a ritual.
There's a guy there.
So,
But it's not a satanic ritual.
No,
it's his own goddamn
it's just a
ritual, okay?
ritual.
I had to call
Yes.
after the big thing happened.
yes,
Stephen
Karla made
Leba
it very
did
clear. It's
Yeah,
just a
he did
ritual.
it was in all the newspapers. It was for a sports 49ers party,
Oh,
and there was something involving some. Boy, do you remember all that it was? There was a pentagram in blood on his back, carved by one of the girls that, also another friend of Karen's, Danielle Willis. Danielle Willis.
Was this when I still lived in San Francisco?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Who had
And
a
this is
pentagram
Stephen
carved?
Leba, who's coming up next.
Oh,
Because he'd been a priest in the Church of Satan, but he was sodomized with a whiskey bottle.
oh.
Are you ready for a question?
Yeah. So anyway, my
You
father
went
had me call to say, don't ever do this again in the name of Satanism or Church of Satan or whatever, because this is your own personal thing. So everybody has to know this is his own personal thing. He's doing for you public. This is not a specific satanic ritual. This is his personal ritual. Okay? Got that? Yes.
Happy Halloween. Yes, you went, you're here in the white shirt. You had a question.
That's his own trip. That's what.
You had a question, dear,
Yeah.
please.
So I'm reading
Yes.
the biography of your father, and there's a lot of details I'm curious if they're true or not. One is that he spoke of having growing up with a tail till his teens and having it sort of
Yes,
removed.
that's absolutely true. Both my parents had tails. When I had an art show in 1999, I wrote up a little thing about the artist, and that was Jim Morton's favorite thing about it. But somebody stole it off the wall and stole all the copies. I said, both of my parents, Adelaide stole it. Both of my parents had tails. And he did. He has a pilonidal cyst, and they wouldn't take him in the military for that was one reason. Considered, what do they call it? Jeep cyst or something like that. Yeah, he did. He was born with a tail, and both my parents had to have their tails removed.
Huh.
That's absolutely true.
And then the other story is that he met Marilyn Monroe playing organ at the Mayan, and they had an affair. Is that true?
I wasn't alive then, so that one I can't vouch for. I was alive and I was there when Jane Mansfield came to our house. And people said, she said right in front of my father said, well, people said that my first wife resembled you. And she said, but she was like a miniature Jane Mansfield. And she said, well, why settle for a miniature if you can have the real thing? No, she was quite a character, and she came to our house like right after her USO tour, And she would leave her clothing there because she wanted to come back to spend more time with my father. And I was a kid, I was a teenager, and I'd be on the phone a whole lot. And she would call and she'd break in with, it used to be able on the phone, break in with an emergency phone call. This is an emergency person-to-person phone call. This is Jane Mansfield, and I would like to speak to Anton LaVey.
Antoine.
She would call Antoine.
Antoine.
So okay, I'll get off the phone. But she would call from all over the world. She'd be like with some prince of some foreign country having dinner, and she'd have them bring a telephone to their table. You must meet this man, Antoine. You must talk to him. He's the most interesting man. And so, yeah, she'd call him from all over the place. Yeah, and then these photos you're seeing tonight, she actually commissioned, she and my father, that she wanted him to come down to the Pink Palace and have photographs taken with her. So you're able to see some of those tonight.
Yes. Any more questions? One more before the midnight ritual. Anybody else? Oh, no more questions. Really?
Right.
Oh yes, you
One last
there,
one.
darling.
More for Boy. Given all the value you gave to all the aesthetic value you gave to your projects, to your musical projects, was that in any way inspired by how much aesthetic value the church gave?
No, I think, because I was well under the way to doing that before I met LaVey. Because I was in this weird milieu where people just stand on stage with the synthesizer or something and do absolutely nothing.
Something more organic.
And I thought I'd want people, if I was going to go see a concert, I would want it to appear like I'd stumbled into some bizarre ceremony or secret ritual or something. So I wanted it to be more ritualistic.
If anything, was it something that LaVey did appreciate that?
Oh, he appreciated the aesthetic, and I played him my Live in Osaka video, and he really, he kind of appreciated what I was doing was not his cup of tea, and he never really got it. But when he saw that video, he said, "This is perfect. This is the most satanic thing I've ever seen." And then the other thing I showed him that he thought was the most satanic thing he'd ever seen, it was a Mark Almond video called A Lover's Spurn, which is a brilliant video, by the way, because Mark Almond actually contacted me with saying, he was going to be introduced to me, and he said, if I meet Boyd, can he induct me into the Church of Satan? And I said, yeah. It's like, I didn't have the authority to do that, but I thought, I'm going to do this. This is a guy LaVey would like, So I did it, and I told him about it, and he said, well, if you think this is a good guy. And I said, well, watch this video. And he watched it, and he just laughed, and he wanted to see it again. And when he liked something, he would just watch it over and over. Because another weird one he liked was, and it would shock you, he loved the Sid Vicious My Way video.
Yes.
He'd watch it and just go, play that again, Blanche.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Boyd. Thank you.